You are now entering Nick and Mello's hyperspace.
I'm Nick, and I think my favorite character from the Bad Batch is definitely Echo.
I'm Kyle on YCT Tower on YouTube, and my favorite character is Wrecker.
Oh, wow. Okay. And I'm Carmelo, and my favorite character is Tech. And I even have a shirt to prove it.
Showing your love. In our journeys through hyperspace, we examine everything and anything from Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young, one old, who came together through the will of the Force.
And in this episode, we are going to be reviewing, commenting, talking, explaining, exploring The Bad Batch, which was an animated show that we had in the past year. 16 episodes, and they're sort of connected to the Clone Wars and are taking those in new ways and all of that. And we invited Kyle to join us today. And we thought it would be really fun to have people from another podcast sort of joining us in the conversation. And we have enjoyed his work in the past. And he has invited us to his show in the past. So we thought this would be a really fun way of doing it. So should we start with maybe general impressions of the show? And Kyle, since you're the guest, we'll give you the microphones first.
Okay, yeah. I probably came into the show a little bit different than a lot of people. I had never watched a lot of the Star Wars animated content when it first came out. And that's something that I began to catch up on when the pandemic first hit. So I had really just finished watching for the first time Clone Wars, Rebels, and Resistance about the time they announced the Bad Batch. So for me, there wasn't like a big gap. It was like, oh, it's here. So to me, it almost felt like, oh, just another season of the Clone Wars versus kind of viewing it as something different. Now, I don't know if I'd picked another season of Clone Wars, if the Bad Batch had been my first choice, but I was still excited for it because I was kind of interested to see where the show would go.
That is interesting because the show does a lot of sort of nostalgia and legacy work for people who grew up watching Clone Wars. And so it's really fun, like Nick. So it'll be really interesting to have your reactions as we talk about this, because you're sort of a different audience than the typical audience. Nick.
Yeah, so I grew up on the Clone Wars and love Rebels, as we've documented well on this podcast. But when it was first announced, I was kind of iffy on the Bad Batch. I was like, I remember their little arc from the Clone Wars and thought, those guys, I don't know if they can do a show based around those guys. They seem very, they seem very fine characters. I just didn't see them as the lead characters of a series. And so I was a little hesitant going into it and end up loving it. I remember we and Carmelo have talked in the past about when it was first coming out, especially, we were just like, what is the show? We weren't really big fans of it. We were just kind of like, where is this going? And then we rewatched it in preparation for this. And I think we've kind of both just kind of a switch just flipped, and we really adore the show now.
When I saw the first 4 episodes of the last season of Clone Wars, which is when the Bad Batch is introduced, I really enjoyed, on the one hand, the idea of quote unquote defective clones that in a way are special. These are our superheroes. These are the superheroes of Star Wars because they have something wrong, but that wrongness is what makes them special, is what makes them more important. And so I was really intrigued by that. I was really turned off by the sort of testosterone level of those 4 episodes. It was sort of like, oh, goodness me. But I was still intrigued by them. And joining and sort of Echo joining in the gang was a really interesting sort of addition of this person who we have known through the Clone Wars shows, and now is inserted into this sort of gang of men who are all quote unquote defective. And so I found really intriguing, which is why I started watching the show. A little bit like Nick, I felt like I was seeing a lot of repetition in the show. I think my main problem at the beginning is that every episode it was another mission. On second viewing, what I realized is those missions are sort of helping us understand who these people are, and also giving us all of this bit of information to put it together towards the end, and maybe even to push it onto season 2. I really liked it the second time.
Yeah.
And I'm actually a little shocked how much I liked it. I was really surprised. I was really surprised. I rewatched it dutifully and ended up enjoying it thoroughly.
I think what maybe the second viewing maybe helped because we kind of knew what to expect, and we kind of already knew these characters a little bit, so it was easier to kind of transition. And for those that did watch the Clone Wars or are in love with the Clone Wars, it's really a direct sequel more so than Rebels ever was, because we do follow up with a lot of characters from Clone Wars to Rebels and see where their story goes and where it ends. But with Bad Batch, it's kind of a direct sequel because it takes place right after the Clone Wars ends, and we kind of see the transition from the Republic to the Empire, and it's a very fascinating time because we don't really get that explored a lot in the movies, not so much in the novels or comics either. They're just kind of, we already know what the Empire is about. We get to see those little things that make the Empire to what they become in A New Hope.
Yeah. Guys, do I remember correctly that the very first episode still has the voiceover narration, and then it's gone after that?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a nice bridge from this used to be the Clone Wars kind of mentality or structure, and then it becomes its own thing. Becomes its own thing.
Which I enjoyed that touch. It's kind of
I thought it was really nice.
Really nice, really cool.
And I really like that first episode. That little movie.
Oh yes,
it's really quite wonderful.
Yeah, I'd say the only thing for me that when the show got off, I was maybe a little concerned about is when Omega was introduced, and I just felt like, are they just figuring out like, oh, people really loved the Mandalorian and Grogu, or are they just trying to replicate the pattern of like the adults chaperoning a little, younger person that's with the kind of cute character that, and I was like, is this the exact same show, just they're just changing the characters a little bit? But I think as they further developed, what that character is, what her backstory was, it did feel like, all right, there was a reason for her to be in this show, not just like, oh, people like Grogu, so let's put another young character in this series.
Everybody, yeah.
He has a cute factor, but she's strong enough, I thought, that it didn't feel like just cute. She wasn't just cute, and I appreciated that as we get to know her through the show.
And I think they made her older enough that she could do stuff. So it wasn't like she was so young that she was somewhat helpless. Like she was old enough, she could begin doing tasks and stuff like that. So that helped a lot with it not feeling like, oh, this is another little helpless baby that needs to be watched after,
and rescued. Yes. I kind of thought it was an interesting flip because I think it's a group of men taking care of a young female character and kind of seeing her inserted and kind of, they're, like you said, in the first Clone Wars arc they show up in, they're kind of all testosterone filled and tough and rough, and kind of seeing her inserted kind of softens them a little bit and kind of changes their view on things and how to approach things. And it's fascinating to see that. Pretty well done, in my opinion. I like that.
I love how they turn into a family.
Yeah.
And how sort of paternity is sort of dumped on them, and then they sort of embrace it. Because once they realize how they are related to her, then they sort of feel this very direct connection. And I'm not going to spoil that until I'm going to wait for that when we get to the spoiler area. But because of that connection, just like Nick and I have talked in our show about families, about non-biological families, sort of creating that sort of family nucleus. And so it's really interesting. Filoni, I think, is really interested in the idea of family. Because I think Rebels it's a family show. It really is a family show. So it was really interesting seeing that element of Rebels being brought onto the Bad Batch, but with a whole bunch of men having a daughter or a kid,
a little sister,
they need to take care of. And so that's really interesting. Can I ask Kyle? Tell me about Wrecker. Tell me why.
I enjoyed Wrecker.
Why?
Yeah.
Because I'm really curious about that.
I think Wrecker was like a good bridge that kind of a lot of his. Well, he seemed like to be the first one that really embraced Omega instantly. I almost viewed her like, oh, they kind of that familial connection very, very quickly. I think he played a key role in kind of getting the other members of the team to kind of realize like, oh, we need to make efforts to bring her in. We can't just treat her like either luggage or a regular soldier. We need to make a bedroom for her, and make sacrifices. Yes. And then a lot of stuff, again, I won't get into a lot of the details yet, but a lot of the stuff that happens to Wrecker, I think, begins to bring the other ones closer together and really realize how much they care for each other. Mm-hmm. And it was also his, nice comedic moments there. I mean, I think of all the members of the team, he's the one that's by far the most different from your typical clone we're used to seeing. We've never really seen a clone remotely like that. I mean, the other ones all have special skills, but personality-wise, they seem very more in line with the other clones.
Right.
He is completely different. And I kind of enjoyed seeing that that side of a clone trooper coming out.
It was like tender testosterone. I really like that. Yeah. Because he's very much a He-Man, but there's this really soft side in there.
Yeah, I liked how they played on expectations, because you would think like that, again, maybe the most masculine of the troopers, but he's the one that kind of gravitates more quickly to Omega, where you think, if you did stereotypes, he'd be the one that'd be the most resistance. And like, why are we dragging along this little girl along with us? But instead, he's the one that bonded with her instantly.
Yeah, no, you're right. I'm already liking Wrecker because the way you're talking about him, liking him more. I like him, but I'm liking him more because of the way that you're explaining him.
I thought too, sometimes in Star Wars, the humor is a little like off-putting with things. But I think the animated Star Wars does a really good job of balancing humor and seriousness. Maybe because it's animated and we just kind of, our brains are conditioned to think that with animated things. But Wrecker to me is one of the funnier characters in all of Star Wars. His line delivery is hilarious. He's just kind of the life of the party. He reminds me a lot of like Michelangelo from the Ninja Turtles.
Yeah,
I enjoy that about him. He's very fun, but when things get serious, he's always there he's a great team player. He loves being there for his brothers, and he's just a cool character. I enjoy his addition.
He's a total Hufflepuff.
Yes, he is.
He is a total Hufflepuff.
Totally,
it's all about you can count on me. I am trustworthy. I am here behind you. He's
always have your back. Yeah, he's great.
Totally. Are we ready for spoilers?
Sure.
I think so. I'm just dying to start talking about details here.
Let's go for it.
So audience, if you want to just stop right now, go watch the show, come back right here and join us in the second half. Spoiler full. We go from spoiler free to spoiler full now. I want to talk about sort of the early days of the Empire.
Okay.
I'm really curious how in 2022 we get Bad Batch, we get Kenobi, we get Andor, and they're all set more or less in that world of sort of like post Revenge of the Sith and pre New Hope.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting how we're sort of filling that area. The Mandalorian is on the other side of the original trilogy, but all of these shows that we got in 2022 are very much in sort of like understanding how the galaxy lives during the Empire.
Yeah, I can't remember which episode it was, but the one where the Bad Batch is on a planet and they see an Imperial parade, and like the citizens of the planet are cheering and happy, and they're kind of like, why are they happy? It's like, well, all they care about is peace. We've been in war nonstop, and it kind of sees, we've never seen that side of like the period where like there probably was a good grace period where people were glad, like, I'm just glad it's over, whatever, Republican Empire, same thing.
Yes.
And I think you see by like Andor's maybe showing the other end of it, where people begin to sour on that initial hope of like, oh, there's peace, things are gonna be better now, and stuff like that. And I can't remember Star Wars ever showing a period where like people were going like, oh, yay, the Empire, just regular people, and I found that very interesting.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
It's kind of like a honeymoon phase. That's Palpatine's promise to bring peace and order, and of course we know he's gonna too much order, more not so much peace. But yeah, that's very interesting seeing the day-to-day lives, and kind of the one part I really enjoyed. We heard about it, I think, in the Mandalorians the first time they brought this up. What are the chain codes?
Chain codes, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, chain codes. I think that's the first place we heard them, or I remember hearing them anyway.
In
But
the Mandalorian, I think that's the first time.
I think that's the first time. But then
I
we
believe
kind of
so,
in the Bad Batch. I love the corporate synergy there. It's great. The then we get to in the Bad Batch, we get to see, they're announcing, hey, if you want, transfer your credits, we'll give you Imperial credits, get your new chain code so you can travel across the galaxy. Like little details like that's really cool and interesting. It makes it not just a kind of a detail to add in the background, but also kind of creates an issue for them because they leave, they defect.
Right.
Now they're on the run, and now they like, oh, it's kind of hard for us to go everywhere. We don't have a chain code. So it kind of adds a foil to their plans.
Yeah. I find it that the second episode is about sort of the beginning of surveillance. Like the whole idea when Cut and his family are trying to get off the planet, and they're all sort of realizing the Empire is already taking control by surveilling everything we do, by making sure that everybody is accounted for and identified. And so I found it really interesting that, in this testosterone-filled animated show, the second episode is an episode of surveillance. It's an episode of control. It's an episode of discipline. And as you're saying, Nick, that how they're outside of that world, and they need to remain outside of that world, because once they are inside, they will be consumed by the Empire in more ways than one. Kyle, you were talking about peace, and it was really interesting how towards the end of the season, we get the arc of Hera Syndulla, and how this notion of what the Empire is and how the Empire represents itself. It's one of those moments, and it's sort of exciting that it is towards the end of the season, because we start seeing, this is when we start seeing all of the things that are happening, not on the military side, not in Camino, but in the sort of like in the public arena. And that those two episodes are really, really quite wonderful. And seeing Hera as a kid with a French accent, she hasn't lost her French accent yet.
And Chopper
is really quite delightful. And Chopper, and a younger Chopper.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I found it very interesting. And obviously, Ryloff's played a big role in all the animated series, as we've seen how they obviously are very fiercely independent people, and how the Empire is already quickly. I'm guessing they made a very early decision, like, all right, Ryloff is one of the planets we need to clamp down on quick.
Oh, I would imagine so. Yes.
Be a serious issue.
Yes.
I mean, some of those early lines, where you have the Imperial officer kind of saying, "Oh, we're here for peace and stability. Y'all are safe. We're here to protect you." As somebody that loves history, some of the things that came to mind immediately is in the aftermath of World War II, where you have the Soviet Union coming in for a lot of Eastern European countries, and like, "Oh, we're just here for stability. We're here to help you." And then you have those discussions like on Ryloth, like, well, if they're here to, like, when are they going to leave?
Right.
Who are you protecting us from? Type of
right.
I will say I like that arc, even though I found it very interesting, was probably one of my least favorites of the series, just because for like the first episode of the two, like the Bad Batch is basically not in it. Now I kind of found it interesting for a first season where you're still kind of trying to introduce the characters to the audience and stuff, that you had an entire episode where they're basically not there. And probably one of my big points the first season, that you had like Echo, and to I think a lesser extent Tech, I don't think got as much character development as maybe some of the other members of the squad, and I would love to have seen more. I think when you kind of did like a 2-episode arc where the main focus is on them, that's kind of what you sacrifice a little bit. So I would have almost expected that story arc maybe to be more of like a season 2 or 3 once you kind of got the initial Bad Batch more firmly established. It's one thing on its own, I kind of enjoyed the arc, but for the overall season, I would have kind of liked if maybe there should have been like a B storyline where you saw them a little bit more, because basically that first episode, they're just not in it except like
that one.
They come and they go.
Right.
Yeah. I I'm going to put my film studies cap on because this is a marketing issue. This is about live action. Hera is coming.
Oh yeah,
we need to set up Hera. We need to bring back Hera. We need to remind Hera. Hera needs to appear in some way, so it's all connected to what's going to happen in 2023.
I think sometimes you run into that a lot with like Star Wars stuff, Marvel. Anytime you're introducing a new character, they're always like, "Well, we need to bring in a few old characters to make some
familiar characters,
just to kind of bring those viewers in and go like, oh, you don't know who these characters are. Well, Hera's going to be here, or we're going to show this type of stuff or that type of stuff." And so so I understand why they do it. It's one of those things like, well, in case you don't like, hey, if you're really into the Clone Wars or Rebels, we're bringing these characters back. I'm sure that's why they decided to bring Rex back and stuff like that. Kind of like, hey, you're not sure about the Bad Batch, but you want to see Rex again.
Right.
Here he is,
And this is one of the really sort of, and I am of two minds in a way. I find it really interesting that through Bad Batch, there are so many characters that come back that make cameo appearances. So many. And so it's really interesting how, if we had 3 hours, it would be really interesting to go one by one and see how they function in the story. Because Kyle, you're right. There's a lot in here about sort of like reminding us of a character. And Hera is in Rebels, not in Clone Wars. And those are different generations. There are the kids that grew up watching Rebels might have seen some Clone Wars, but not all of it. And so they're trying to bring a Rebels character into the Clone Wars narrative of the Bad Batch. So when she shows up in live action in Ahsoka, everybody is up to date. Everybody is sort of connected to what is happening. But Rex is like that. They're just Saw Gerrera shows up in the first episode. They're just they're a whole list.
Some is like, like to me, like the Cad Bane Fennec story arc with, that somehow to me felt like it made more sense plot point. Like it makes sense that like somebody hired a bounty hunter to go after these people.
I agree.
And at the same time, they were still somewhat in that, Omega was in it a lot. And so the Hera one was the only one that bothered me a little bit. Because like to me, like they could have figured maybe a little bit more way just to have a little bit more Bad Batch in that episode and still like you feel like, oh, this is
you have a good point.
Kind of like, the Book of Boba Fett complaint where basically like in the middle of the Book of Boba Fett, you had 2 episodes of The Mandalorian. For this one, it kind of felt like you basically had
an episode of Rebels.
That one Rebels basically popped up in the middle of Bad Batch. Or Rebels prequel, basically.
That's exactly right.
Well, and back to your point you said a minute ago about it would make sense that they, the Caminos would hire a bounty hunter to go after Omega. Like they could have chosen a number of bounty hunters. There's plenty of them, but they chose a character that just showed up last year in Mandalorian, and then who's going to be in the Book of Boba Fett. So it was kind of like another one of those, hey, you remember this character? She's showing up again. Be on the lookout.
I loved her.
I did love her.
The Cad Bane Fennec was just.
It was really good.
It was one of my favorite episodes. It was just so exciting.
It was very fun.
She was relentless. She just kept showing up.
Yes.
And I thought that was really, really fun.
It was cool. And I loved how forget her name, the actress that played Fennec in Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett. She voiced the character again.
Yes. Her name is Ming Na Wen.
Yeah, she was incredible. And that was just fun, kind of like
she's great.
And for kids that did grow up on the Clone Wars, that's the first time we've seen Cad Bane in like 10 plus years. Like he didn't show up, in Rebels. We didn't know what happened to him. And then
remind me of the order. We saw Cad Bane animated here before we saw him on Boba Fett.
We did. So it was kind of like like, hey, you like this guy? He's showing up in Boba Fett.
It's coming.
So, right. So it's
I screamed like a Justin Bieber fan in my living room in Book of Boba Fett when he was walking down the desert, and I'm like, no.
I did it in Bad Batch when he showed up and I heard the voice. I thought, oh my gosh, it was intense.
There. I sort of was like, oh yeah, nice character from Clone Wars. But in the live action, I was not expecting it. I was not expecting him to be there.
He's one of those characters that I enjoy in animation more than live action.
He scares the big Jesus out of me.
He's just great.
The thing that I didn't mention in the spoiler free that I want to mention here is the clone connection between Omega and the Bad Batch.
Yes.
And I think it's really interesting how Nick and I, in our show about rebels and in the show about families, we have talked about non-biological families in Star Wars, and how the crew of the Ghost becomes a family even though they're not biologically connected. What is interesting here is that these are biologically connected. They are clones of each other. And she's the first generation. So she's the grandmother of them all. She just happens to be a little girl right now. And so I found it fascinating. The more I knew, and we know very little about her, but the more we knew about Omega, the more fascinated I was. And you mentioned at the beginning of the show, Kyle, this the sort of cute factor of Omega. And it's there. But I love that as we learn to know more about her, there's a lot more going on here. And I found her very intriguing.
I mean, the thing that surprised me the most, which I would never have guessed what happened when they, revealed at the end that, she's actually older than them, and, she saw them basically being grown. And so, like, instead of, this entire time you thought she was kind of looking up to them, and you realize, like, no, she almost has a maternal instinct. Like, she basically saw these people being born.
Yes.
In reality, like, that's the viewpoint she's been coming from this entire time, not what you think that, like, oh, she's a little kid and this is the adult clone she wants to grow up to be like. It's like, no, these are like her kids. And I would have never guessed that in a million years until they revealed it. I was like, oh, that was really a very brilliant and I think
nice
great
twist
decision to kind of do it that way.
It is one of my favorite things of the season, sort of discovering who she is and how she really relates to the Bad Batch. I thought that was just beautiful. Just beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing I'm kind of interested in, as we talked about corporate synergy earlier, that in family, do we think at some point she's going to sprout up in live action and meet her brother Boba Fett at some point? So if there's going to be another season of the Book of Boba Fett, well, of course we don't know what happens to Omega, but well, at some point they want to bring that along and go like, hey, Boba, you were alone. Here's your sister.
I would have a
you
feeling.
Have a sister.
Yeah.
I would have a feeling he shows up more so probably in animated form before she goes to live action, is what I would think. Just because I feel like if you bring her in live action, it might be a little confusing to people that did not see, the animated series. So, but I do like that idea. I want them to meet really bad because I just think that'd be fascinating.
Do we know if it's going to be more than 2 seasons? We don't know if we don't know that this is the final season. Say that again, Kyle.
I don't think they've announced, but I could be wrong.
Okay. I don't think they've said anything about it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anything, but I can't keep track.
Yeah.
There's just a lot going on.
So much. But I enjoyed that. To me, that was one of my favorite reveals of the season was her and Boba being kind of like Alpha and Omega. That makes sense why her name's Omega now. And I find it interesting too that she is a female clone of Jango, and when all the other clones are males, obviously. So I don't know if she never met Jango or what, if she even had a relationship with him. I'm curious about that.
Or
if he even knows about her.
I hadn't thought about that.
Because he raised Boba until he passed. So I'm just kind of curious, was she just kind of another kid he wanted, or was this just the Kaminoans just kind of doing something like behind his back, or what exactly it was?
I mean,
still some mystery.
That was my theory, is that maybe they were kind of nervous what Jango was up to, and maybe like, well, we need to create a backup in case he takes Boba. And so, like, my guess is they didn't know. That's why she was kind of hidden in that lab a little bit. But
makes sense.
I'm hoping we get some flashbacks, or maybe she talks about more and kind of get a little bit more of her origin story, because we still don't know a lot about her and what she was doing on Camino.
Very true. Very true.
In that lab.
Mm-hmm.
I find it intriguing that her name is Omega, which is the last letter of the Greek alphabet, not the first letter of the Greek alphabet, which is Alpha. So it's really interesting that she's sort of the first generation, but her name was Omega. Maybe she was the last one before the mass production. I'm once again, it's sort of like we have all these questions,
right?
Which is part of the reason why I'm really excited about Bad Batch season 2. Sorry, no hablo inglés. English is my second language. And because there's so much we don't know about her.
Mhm.
So much we don't know about her, and I find that I'm really curious. I'm very, very curious.
I would like to talk about the Kaminoans for a second. We haven't really touched on them, and it kind of relates to the chips. I was curious of how they would handle the Kaminoans throughout this season and going forward. And obviously, I think the implication is they're pretty much all extinct for the most part. It seems like,
Right.
Because we don't really see them anywhere else in the timeline, as far as
Right.
I'm aware. So I was kind of, part of me, it felt like kind of a passing of the torch or an end of an era, because once Kamino's gone, it's kind of like Clone Wars is officially that whole, it's over. The clones are kind of being phased out.
Right.
Kind of a whole transition period that I found fascinating, and curious to see Nala Se still survived. We know of. I'm curious to see if we'll ever see any Kaminoans again, because I always find their species and they're so advanced and kind of so disconnected from the Republic and the Empire. Like, kind of see if we'll ever see them again, or if we'll ever know more about them in the future. But seeing Kamino destroyed was very, very kind of shocking to me. I was not expecting them to do that.
Me neither. I didn't know that was going to happen at all. I love seeing more of Kamino, and I love seeing more of Kamino in the first days of the Empire, because we always connected it to the Clone Wars, and so it was really exciting for me, narratively speaking, historically speaking, to sort of see that transition from the old Republic to the Republic to the Empire, and how that affects Kamino itself. Because we do see Kamino a little bit in Clone Wars, especially in season 6. I think it's when we do the
chips
with the chips and all of that.
Yeah.
And there are a few other moments where it shows up, but for the most part, it's not something that is constant in Clone Wars.
Right.
And so most of what we knew came from Attack of the Clones from episode 2. So it's really fun getting back to that place. And this constant language of home. The Bad Batch keep talking about this place as home, because it is. That's where they were created. That's where they grew up. That's where they were trained. And so it's really interesting, this sort of almost patriotism for Kamino itself. I found it really beautiful.
And I'm glad they kind of gave the Kaminoans like actually some own screen time. They weren't a lot of times they were just background characters and they'd have a line, but you really weren't getting their perspective any. And then you actually get them to see, like, when they realize, like, oh, I think we're in trouble. How do we prove ourselves, valuable to the Empire? So we're still around. Maybe we need to start setting up contingency plans and like that. So I kind of enjoyed seeing that aspect of it, because we really haven't seen that before. They were just kind of background characters, basically.
Yeah, and they were connected to the clones. They were sort of the clone creators, and so they were there as a presence connected to the place where the clones were created. But you're right, Kyle. This is the season where we get to see their precarious condition after the end of the Clone Wars, and the Empire just not being interested in spending all the money creating clones, where they can just snatch people through slavery and coercion and train them to be soldiers that can't shoot anything.
Right.
Which in a way, once again, it makes sense. Like, if you just collect thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers and train them badly, this is what happens. They can't shoot.
They're incompetent most of the time.
Totally.
I kind of been Nala Se, the one who, I kind of found her the most interesting. I think she has a real connection, and she really cares for Omega. I think that's one thing that I found really a twist that I wasn't expecting. And I'm curious to see, we know where she ends up on Mount Tantus at the end of the season, what she's going to do with the Empire, like what they're going to use her for, and if she'll ever reconnect with Omega, or kind of, she helped the Bad Batch in the first episode. I find that very fascinating. I think her real intentions never got out there to the rest of the Kaminoans, but I wonder if the Empire will know of her helping and her connection to Omega. I'm curious to see how they play with that.
Does she show up at all in any of the trailers for season 2?
No, she wasn't in a trailer.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to be a Bad Batch season 2 virgin when I watch the first episode.
You're going in blind.
I'm going to lose my virginity in my
Yes.
living room. Anything else?
I mean, probably the other thing I enjoyed kind of on the Empire side, where you get the entire thing with Crosshair and the entire, I mean, with the entire Bad
Yeah,
Batch.
we haven't talked about Crosshairs,
Does
right?
it mean, what does it mean to be a good soldier? Crosshairs coming from like, oh, good soldiers always obey orders, and the rest of the teams clearly come like, good soldiers only obey good orders. They don't, so it's that
blindly follow.
very interesting to see that thing that honestly is a very real world scenario that we see play out countless times through history. Is like, when is it a soldier's job to say, no, I'm not doing this?
Yeah.
And seeing how both sides firmly believe they're correct. I thought that was a kind of an interesting topic again.
Yeah.
For an animated series,
Yes.
Yeah.
Crosshairs was interesting to me, especially in the second half of the season, because he still feels sort of the connection with the Bad Batch. And when Omega saves him, there's this sort of like life debt, like the Wookiees would say, about what she did for him. And so I like him that he is problematic and imperial in that sort of like fascist kind of way, while at the same time there is a little bit of heart there. There's a little bit of a morality, sort of a duty that is still not necessarily completely gone to the dark side of the Empire in that sense. I love Tech because he's a nerd.
Yes.
And Star Wars fans are nerds, and so he's me, and so I just love having a nerd clone. It was just wonderful, and he talks like my husband. He has this sort of like very, very precise, logical reasoning about everything, and I've
very literal.
25 years with a literalist, and so it's very comforting seeing my husband on an animated show. It's really quite fun.
Before go back to Crosshair real quick, I think the elephant in the room was the big twist, which I saw people online talking about and speculating that his inhibitor chip, it wasn't his chip. He just chose to go with the Empire, and I think that was more heartbreaking. And
that makes that makes it more interesting.
Yeah, it does make it more interesting.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it just kind of like, wow, it was a gut punch. It was a real gut punch. I mean, he was kind of go back to the Ninja Turtles. He's kind of the Raphael of the group anyway. Kind of doesn't like to play by the rules of the others. Doesn't like to take orders from the leader like Hunter. But still gut punch. I was not expecting that, and just hurt me a little bit. So I'll be curious where he goes.
Welcome to life, Nick.
Right.
People make all sorts of decisions.
Yes.
For all sorts of reasons.
Yes.
Again, it kind of, like usually your typical animated show that explores something like that, like, oh, if you have free will, everybody's going to make the right decision. It's shown like, oh no, some people are going to choose that size willingly. They weren't tricked.
Right.
They believe that. And
that's right.
That was a kind of an interesting decision to make that I wasn't expecting until they revealed it. I was like, oh, that was that was interesting.
It was actually one of my favorite things from first viewing. Even though I was a little bored with the show from first viewing, that was sort of like, oh, okay, you got me now. This is interesting. I don't want the show to end without talking about our Trandoshan bartender.
Sid.
Yeah.
Sid's very funny.
I was just tickled by her. This no nonsense. She had sort of a Carrie Fisher kind of feel. Not a Leia kind of feel, but a Carrie Fisher kind of feel. No nonsense on the ground. I know what I'm doing. Shut up. Let me talk now. You're doing this. Yes, you're doing this now.
Well, I like the idea that they realized like they almost needed a character to kind of teach the Bad Batch. Like, this is how the real world works, because y'all just been in the military and just been doing that. And you really don't know how you need to do stuff if you don't have like entire support, in place that's giving you food, weapons, telling you what to do. You've never had to worry about that your entire life. This is what you have. Money's important,
Right. And they kind of like, it's kind of a character who kind of puts their egos in check a little bit. She's always like, you guys really are sheltered and don't know how, like you were saying, you don't know how the real works at all. Like, you can't just do this, or you think this is free, like things cost money. And they just,
Yeah.
I love the nickname she gave Tech was Goggles. I just thought that was hilarious. I don't know why. I thought that was so funny. He's another character that her humor is great.
I mean, I think even see like they pepper the entire series with that type of stuff. But like when they land on the planet where they run into Finnick and they first land and they don't know they need to pay to park their ship and just little stuff like that they've never had to worry about. They're just sprinkled in and they're like, oh yeah, they've never had to worry about stuff like that. They just landed wherever they wanted to, or there was always food available and stuff like that. So just I'm glad they did just transition them to being like super, rescue squad or bounty hunters, and there was no transition where they didn't struggle to make that transition.
Right.
It kind of reminds me of like a young person when they go off to college and, parents are paying for everything. Like you got food, you got shelter, and then you go off to college and you're like, oh, I have to pay to park. I have to get my license renewed every year. I have to pay for my own insurance. It's kind of like that kind of thing is what it
Mom, how do I make rice?
How do I make a doctor's appointment? Like,
how do I make doctor's? Yeah.
Right.
So now the Bad Batch needs to do it all.
Right. They're kind of entering that adulthood phase.
Thank God Omega is there. The voice of reason.
Right. I like how Sid also kind of had a connection with Omega. They become like really close and kind of really good. She does use Omega, but
I wasn't gonna say
she uses her, but I feel like it's a genuine kind of, they kind of respect each other more of
Oh yeah.
I don't think she's just out to use her or be evil with her, but it's just very funny.
Well, the fact that she's the first one that realizes like Omega has some special talents that the rest of the group maybe haven't noticed because of her age, but they realize like, oh, there's nothing tactical on her. And then that's something that has been revealed. Like I know they say she's an unaltered clone, but she seems to be like supernaturally good at a lot of things. So like, was she actually altered in some way, or given a little extra boost compared to the other clones?
I'm assuming that she has. She might be a first generation clone, but she's not identical to Jango Fett.
Well, kind of like Boba. He's kind of the same way. He's kind of good at everything. He's a great shot. He's tactically smart. He knows how to fight. I mean, she's kind of just the opposite side of the coin. And
so, shall we talk a little bit about sort of expectations, desires, wishes for season 2? Because I think we've been talking about 4 hours now.
Yeah.
I don't have very many expectations, so why don't you guys start?
My first, thought after season 1 is like, I want to see because obviously they made some connections with Rex and stuff like that. Like, do they continue to get more deeper into the rebellion, the early stages of, rebel activity, or do they go in a different route? Because I think there's those two options. Are they going to go more towards, that side and get wound into the early days of the Rebel Alliance? Are they running around doing stuff like that? Or are they doing missions with Andor at some point, and on the timeline? Or do they go a different route? Do they go into the unknown regions or something like that? So I was kind of very curious to see which direction they were going to take the show. And this is before seeing the trailer and all that type of stuff. There's a lot of possibility because they didn't really leave it firm, like what's happening next. They just kind of, all right, we've firmly wrapped this up. I think they did that purposely. I don't know if they knew there were going to be a second season, maybe like in case there's just one.
Yeah.
This can be satisfying to viewers, but kind of curious to see which way the Bad Batch chooses to go,
I kind of agree with you. I had the idea, and for preference, I know Carmelo said you haven't seen any of the trailers for the second season. So, but in just a quote that I think Hunter says in one of the trailers, he said, "We're here to fight." And I don't know, that could be completely out of context, but I took that as, like you were saying, Kyle, I think they are going to be involved with the rebellion because we see Bail Organa in one of the trailers. We see Rex, obviously. So I wonder if, and we know Rex and Ahsoka are talking with Bail at this time. So I wonder if they are going to be involved somehow. Maybe like not directly, but maybe tangentially. They're saying, "Hey, can you go do this for me?" But it's really for the rebellion, you see. So I wonder if that's how they're going to be involved. I'm curious because I feel like in the first season, they realized that we can't just kind of sit back and just not be involved with the Empire, kind of like an Andor. The Empire is going to affect us at some point, so we kind of have to do something about it.
Right. As I mentioned before, the thing that I'm wanting more of is I want to know more about Omega, that she sort of becomes even more important in the second season because I'm fascinated by her. It's interesting that you guys are talking because you've seen the trailers and I haven't that you guys are talking about sort of the beginnings of the rebellion. But this is super early. I mean, this is like right after Order 66. So it's been weeks, months, but no more than that. And so it'll be, I'm interested in sort of seeing if the beginning of season 2, there has been a jump.
I think they have said that it's going to take place a year after season 1. So,
okay.
So there's a little bit of
sense.
a jump. Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes
Mega
sense.
looks a little older. So she, I think.
So that'll be, I'm curious. And it's what, January 4th? Is that when it comes
January 4th. I'm excited.
So that's a Wednesday. They're still doing Wednesdays.
Yes.
Yeah, still doing Wednesdays.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Damn it. I teach on Wednesdays. So I'm going to have to get up at 5 a.m. to watch these things.
To check it out.
I need to stop teaching my Star Wars class on a Wednesday.
Right.
Kyle, before we go, did you want to talk a little bit about your show so our audience knows about the kinds of things that you do?
Yeah, sure can. Yeah, so like again, you can find me on YouTube under YHC Tower. Talk about a lot of Star Wars stuff, everything from books, movies, the TV shows, all that type of stuff. I do reviews for all the episodes as they come out. But if you're not into Star Wars, which if you are not, I'm not sure why you're watching this video. But I also I'm a big book nerd and period. So I do a lot of book reviews for non-Star Wars stuff as well. But anytime a new Star Wars series is coming out, like I'm reviewing all the episodes, so you'll get about half Star Wars content, half other book related stuff.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kyle. Thank you so much for being with us. It was curious being 3 rather than 2.
Just the 2 of us.
So it was a fun interaction. So
it was.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Kyle. We'll see you on the next one. May the force be with you. May the force be with you. Bye.